Lovely. Over to you, Michael.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the invitation to speak to you all. It's really hot outside, and I think we should start with that because it's really hot. Everybody, we need to remember to stay hydrated. I know it's difficult, but it's actually really important for the brain. Even mild dehydration can reduce cognitive function or executive function, so it can reduce attention, concentration, memory. So that's the first brain tip for today is stay hydrated. It's actually really, really important for your brain. Okay, so my name is Michael Gray. I work at Loughborough University, and I also work at the new National Rehabilitation Center. My expertise is in acquired brain injury. So I'm actually also the secretary for the UK Acquired Brain Injury Forum. So I've been doing a lot of work in this area for quite some time now. Um, why Loughborough University? Well, it's because the other thing that I do is brain injury in elite athletes. So I decided to move to Loughborough University because we've got access to more elite athletes. Right. So what I'm going to do today is try to tell you a story of how our understanding of the brain has changed and why this has completely transformed the way we think about rehabilitation after stroke. Oh, and my pointer won't work. There we go. Okay. So this fellow is called Santiago Ramon y Cajal. He's widely regarded as the father of modern neuron science. You can see he's looking through a microscope here. This microscope that he used is over 100 years old, obviously. And by today's standards, it's remarkably primitive. You could probably buy a children's microscope on Amazon with better optics than the device that he was using at the time. So he's really famous for, among other things, using a silver staining technique developed by Camillo Golgi. So anybody that's done any biology in university at all has come across this notion of Golgi staining. Most people in biology have used it, if maybe not knowing who invented it. So Cajal used at the time this very new technique, and he produced these extraordinary drawings of the nervous system. And you can see a spinal cord section here. Now he's hand drawn this, looking through the microscope and drawing this, this I think really lovely picture. Now this is important because at the time, many scientists believed that the brain was a continuous fused network. Cajal reached a very different conclusion. And he said that the brain was actually made up of billions of individual nerve cells, and they all communicate with each other. So Cajal actually shared the 1906 Nobel Prize with Camillo Golgi. And it's an interesting story. I'll just give you the highlight of it. The important thing with this is one of these funny things in science. These two men really did not like each other. They disagreed vehemently about how the nervous system was formed. So they were awarded the prize together. They stood up on the stage, and even while they were up on the stage accepting their Nobel prizes, they were still arguing with each other. Now it turns out that, and fortunately for us, Cajal was right. Cajal's idea was that the nervous system is combined of billions of different neurons rather than one fused whole system. Now, the brain has approximately 86 billion neurons. So each neuron forms connections with between tens and thousands of other connections or other neurons. So that creates somewhere between 100 and 500 trillion synapses. Now, some of you will remember the name, the famous physicist, Richard Feynman. Feynman called these really big numbers. And what he meant by really big numbers is these are numbers that it's not in our sphere of knowledge. We don't really know what a billion is. We don't have a feel for that. You know what 10 is. You can kind of picture what 100 is. Once we start getting to 1,000, that's a little bit more difficult to consider. And a million, as soon as we get beyond that, we just have no concept of these sizes of the numbers. So let's put that in perspective. We think there are about 100 billion stars in our galaxy. So your brain contains roughly as many neurons as there are stars in the Milky Way. And then it's even and then there are hundreds or even thousands of times more connections than the stars in our galaxy, probably close to what's in the universe. Um, Now, the connections look a little bit like this. So Cahal couldn't see this, but this is what we call a synapse. And the idea is that we get nerve conduction through this synapse. So every thought, every memory, every movement you make depends on signals passing through these tiny little connections. And I think the most important thing with this slide and the message behind this slide is that there is an enormous network, and that provides quite a lot of redundancy. So if one pathway is damaged, for example, the pathway for these neurons that I've got on the screen here, the brain might be able to find another route. And that's really important for us for rehabilitation. Okay, so this is a fellow called Wilder Penfield. He was a Canadian neuroscientist. He did a really important set of experiments in humans, who were undergoing awake neurosurgery. So what you can see on the right hand side is a human brain actually, and you can see some labels on it. So what he's done is he's either stimulated parts of the body, or he's actually stimulated the brain directly and see which parts of the body are connected to which parts of the brain. So he created something we now call the homunculus, which is a map of the brain, if you will, that tells us which part of the brain is responsible for which part of the body's function. And we have a really good detailed map of this. I won't go into the detail of it any more than that. We'll move now to monkeys. And I promise I'm not going to show you monkey experiments or videos or anything like that. I'm going to show you the results of them. So this is a squirrel monkey. And the reason we've used monkeys is that, and some of the most important discoveries in neuroscience have come from studies in non-human primates. They need to be non-human primates because of the hand function. We can't use rats and that type of thing for this because the connections between the brain and the muscles is fundamentally different. So we use these little guys. Their hand function is extremely similar to ours. They use individual fingers that other animals don't use. They perform precise grasping movements, and the motor cortex is organized in much the same way as the human brain. So you can see a comparison between them here. So the human brain on the left, obviously, and the squirrel monkey on the right, they look fairly similar. The big difference is we have more convolutions. We have many more neurons, much more surface area than does the monkey. But the important thing is that the organization of the monkey cortex is remarkably similar to our own. Okay, so there's an important set of experiments, probably I think the most important experiment for rehabilitation was done by a fellow called Randy Nudo. So Randy was interested in how the brain communicates with muscles, and he did an important set of experiments here. So if you look on the right-hand side of this, you can see a brain and you can see a muscle. And so we can either record or we can stimulate through that electrode on the brain. Oh, I can point to it, of course. So we can stimulate or we can record, and we can and then we can look at which neurons are actually firing. We can then at the same time record muscle activity, electrical muscle activity, or electrical activity from the muscles. If we combine these two things, then we can produce a map like this over here. So don't worry about the detail of the map. The most important thing is the blue bits. So these blue bits here are areas of the motor cortex that are excited when we do finger extension. Okay, so blue is finger extension. All the other ones are different muscles responsible for different functions. So what Randy did is to take some squirrel monkeys, and he would make these initial cortical map recordings. He would then induce a stroke, a simulated stroke in these monkeys. And the way he did it is he used a little laser, and he just destroyed a tiny part of the brain that's responsible for finger movement. Nothing else, just a small area of the brain that was responsible for finger movement. and then he had so all the monkeys had this lesion. Some of the monkeys were just let to recover as they would with no intervention, and other monkeys underwent some pretty progressive rehabilitation. So what they did is they used food pellets, and you can see here the monkey had to put its fingers into the well. Um, these aren't very good pictures; they're taken from a video. But what you can see is the monkey reaching into a big well here and pulling out a finger or a food pellet. Now these monkeys were really motivated to do this. What we do with these types of experiments is we don't feed them for a couple hours. Actually, in a similar way to the way you might train a dog, if you don't feed it, or if you do the training when the animal is hungry, they're more likely to be motivated to do these tasks. So we had one group of monkeys that just went about their days, and he had another group of monkeys that he was training repeatedly. Now you'll see in this little picture here there are wells of different sizes. So what would happen is every time the monkey became quite good at plucking these food pellets out of the well, he would make the well smaller. And they would go on and they would do this practice for about 6 weeks. So then what Randy did is record their cortical activity after after this training. And what you can see is the finger area here over here in blue. If you compare the right side to the left side, you can see there's quite a lot of expansion in the cortex because those fingers were being used. Now, that's the important thing between the groups. The other monkeys, the control monkeys, their cortical representation contracted. And the reason they contracted is that they weren't using that arm to get the food pellets. They used their non-affected arm. So they would stop using the affected arm and start using the non-affected arm. So that non-affective arm got better, but the cortical representation for the arm that was that was damaged, that actually shrank. Now, those monkeys that underwent this really strong really strong rehabilitation, their cortical representation improved. So this illustrates two really important concepts. The brain is going to respond to experience. We call this experience-based neuroplasticity. And there can be two kinds of responses. You can have maladaptive plasticity, like the monkeys who didn't use their arm and their cortical representation shrank, or you can have adaptive neuroplasticity. Those would be the animals that were trained and their cortical representation expanded. Now, of course, when we think about function, which monkeys do you think got better? Well, the answer is the monkeys that were trained got much better than the monkeys that stopped using their arms. So what about humans? This is my friend, James Piercy. James and I have been working together for probably 15 years ago. James sustained quite a severe traumatic brain injury many years ago. Some of you will have seen James. He is a science communicator, and he does a lot of work in educating people about acquired brain injury. His catchphrase is that recovery is a lifelong process. And you can see this is actually James's brain here, and this was an MR showing some of the lesions that were in his brain after his injury. Now, James and I were working together, and he came to me and said, let's see if we can reproduce a really famous experiment. And that was that while his daughter has now graduated from music school, James thought, let's try to learn to play the piano. He'd never played piano before. And so he took something relatively simple. I'm not a musician, but for the musicians among us, apparently this is very, very simple. And he tried to learn it with his left hand. So it's a hand that was actually affected by his injury. Now, what we did is we used a technique called transcranial magnetic stimulation. So effectively what we do is we stimulate one side of the brain over the motor cortex here. It's a magnetic pulse that induces electric current into the brain and excites the brain tissue. That brain is connected actually to the other side. So the left side of the brain connects to the right function of the right hand. So we recorded muscle activity in James at the same time that we were stimulating his brain. Very similar to what we were doing with the monkeys. Now, to make sure that we knew where we were stimulating, we used a technique called navigated brain stimulation. So we've got a camera up here that can see where the coil is. I have an MRI image of James's brain over here, and you can see I'm looking at the scan over here. I'm not looking at James because I'm moving the coil as I look at that monitor. So I know precisely where I am stimulating James's brain. And it looks something like this. I'm ready. James, ready. I'm ready. Stimulators on, Sarah. So those clicks you are hearing is me moving the coil randomly over top of James's brain within a specific area. And I'm not showing it, but I'm recording the electrical muscle activity at the same time. And I'll then match these two. So we'll just stop that. I'll then match these two so that you can actually see when I match these two, I can superimpose the electrical activity over top of the brain area, and I can produce a brain map very similar to what Randy Nudo did with his monkeys. So we can do effectively a similar experiment. Obviously, we're not going to induce a stroke in James. He's going to learn a task. So his task again was to, there we go. So what we would do is we would stimulate before, he would then do some piano training, and then we would stimulate the same areas after 2 weeks after that training, and we would see if the map changed. So here he is just practicing. This is day one. Again, he's never played before. And I should note that this is many, many years after James's accident. So a week later, he's better. It's not perfect, but he's better. And this is 2 weeks later. So you can see he hasn't got it precisely, but he's much, much better. And if he continued to practice, he would get even better and better. So what happened to James's brain? Well, here's his left motor cortex, and that didn't change. Now, that's not surprising because remember, the left motor cortex controls the right arm, and the right hand in this case, and we were exercising the left hand. So I put this up here to see that to show you that it works. If we don't change the brain, we get a similar amount of activity before and after training. What happened to the cortex that was actually exercised? We can see here his right motor cortex there's a lot more red, which means that it's a lot more electrical activity in his muscles, or a lot more connectivity between the brain and those muscles that we were training. So it works. Just like Randy Nudo's monkey experiments, James's brain reorganized in response to this intensive and task-specific practice. Okay, so we see real evidence of cortical reorganization. Now, what are the key principles to neuroplasticity? There are about 10 of them. I'm going to show you 8 because we can reduce them down to about 8. So the first one we call use it or lose it. Now, this is similar to Randy's monkeys that were the control monkeys, the ones that didn't practice. What happened to their brain? The cortical, because they weren't using the affected limb, the cortical representation shrank, and that produced a negative reinforcement cycle, which meant that they were practicing less The brain then was used less, they practiced less, on and on like that. So use it or lose it. And the important message from that is that we really need to encourage the use of the affected limb. And that leads us to the next principle, which is use it and improve it. Every successful attempt strengthens the underlying neural pathways. Just like those monkeys that we saw that were undergoing the rehabilitation and therefore had a better outcome after 6 weeks, a better practical outcome after 6 weeks, I should say, and they had increased cortical representation. The next one is specificity. And what this means essentially is you need to practice the function you want to improve. Now, this is well known now amongst physical therapists, or amongst all of the different areas of physical therapists. This hasn't always been the case. For example, we used to, when I was a PhD student, we were still having people sit in chairs, moving their legs independently, and thinking that would help walking. We now know that it doesn't do that at all. We need to practice what we're actually trying to do. So context is important. If we want to improve walking, we have to practice walking. If we want to improve reaching, we have to practice reaching. If in the case of Randy Nudo's monkeys and of James's piano, if we want to practice or improve finger movement, we have to actually practice finger movement. Repetition is really important. Most of you heard this concept, the 10,000 experts concept, where if you practice something for 10,000 hours, you can become an expert. That's not really true, but the concept is true. The number isn't true, but the concept is true. The more we practice something, the better we will get at it. And so we need hundreds to thousands of repetitions. The brain learns through this repeated experience. The next one is intensity. Practice needs to be sufficient to drive that change. And I think that the important thing here is that the tasks shouldn't necessarily be easy. You shouldn't be successful every single time. They need to be a challenge. And if they, just like Randy's monkeys with the size of the well, if we start with a large well, as soon as that becomes easy for the monkey, we move to a smaller well, and then a smaller one, and then a smaller one. So that intensity or that challenge is really important. The next principle is called salience. This is the idea that rehabilitation needs to be meaningful. So if this could be things like making a cup of tea is meaningful. This is why when you undergo stroke rehabilitation, that's one of the big things that we physiotherapists like to teach and occupational therapists like to teach is making a cup of tea. Practice that exercise because it means something to you. An example that I like to use is I used to do a lot of work in walking rehabilitation, and we would move to people walking on treadmills, and they'd be staring at a wall in front of them, not even looking at a window. They'd be looking at a blank wall, walking on a treadmill. That's just not meaningful. And I'm going to show you some slides later for where we can do walking training, and it really becomes quite meaningful. Next one is timing. There are a few things that are important here. One is that early rehabilitation is really important. The sooner we can start, the better rehabilitation can be. And so for years, there was a constant discussion between the therapists who wanted to start really, really early and the doctors who naturally, of course, want to make it safe before we start early. But there was this notion that we need to rest for long periods of time after stroke. And we now know that that's not the case. And that's not how it works now either. It used to work that way many years ago. So timing is really important. The other thing is that the timing of the rehabilitation is important because we know that fatigue is a big factor in what's the word I'm looking for? Fatigue is a big factor in reducing rehabilitation. So we want to try to do these exercises when we're not in a fatigued state, and that could be mental fatigue or physical fatigue. And this leads us nicely to sleep and recovery. So we didn't talk about that in the two examples that I'd used previously, but learning actually continues between the therapy sessions. one of the reasons we sleep at night is to consolidate our memory, both cognitive memory and physical memory. So we know, for example, there's an area in the brain called the hippocampus that's responsible for memories. And we know that when we're sleeping, that hippocampus, if you sleep in an fMRI scanner, that hippocampus is really, really active. So we think that actually dreaming, that's one of the most important things of sleep. And that's where we believe that the brain is laying down the memories that is picked up during that day. And it's the same thing with the motor system. Sleep is really important for recovery. Okay, so if we think now about supporting recovery after stroke, the science is actually pretty simple. We know that practice is super important. We need to use the affected arm or the affected leg or the affected hand and avoid this notion of learned non-use. It really is important that we practice with the function that is challenged. We need repetition. So recovery requires many, many repetitions. As we said, the brain learns through repeated experience. Challenge. The task, as I said before, the task shouldn't be too easy. If every movement succeeded effortlessly, the brain has no reason to adapt. It can already do those movements. So the goal, if every movement fails, then people become frustrated and they disengage from it. And we've all experienced some of that. So the goal is to challenge the brain at the right level. Small errors are actually really valuable because they provide information to the brain for learning. So as a guide, what we generally like to do is aim for a success of around 75 to 80%. So that's enough success to stay motivated, but it's enough error to get the brain to keep learning. The next one is physical activity. So this is that mind-body paradigm that I know you've heard all about. Exercise really supports the overall brain health. Even in people with acquired brain injury, exercise becomes really, really important. So it creates a biological environment that really helps to support that plasticity. And there is loads of evidence to support that statement. And the last one, again, what can we do to support recovery after sleep is really look at after stroke, is really look at rest and at sleep. So rehabilitation is really about creating the right experience to promote that adaptive neuroplasticity and not have as much maladaptive plasticity. Okay. What can we do to enhance neuroplasticity? I'm going to take you through a number of techniques. So one of those techniques now is brain stimulation. So we have a technique that we call, well, actually transcranial brain magnetic stimulation is the technique that I used with James's brain. We can use it as a way to probe the nervous system. We can also use it by changing the stimulation patterns as a way to influence the brain. So we can excite regions to make them a little bit more active. Or if we have areas in the brain that are too active, we can inhibit those areas just by changing the type of stimulation that we use. Recently, there's been a new therapy using magnetic stimulation called therapeutic brain stimulation, and that seems to have a lot of promise. Using similar stimulators, similar technique, just a different stimulation paradigm. Another group of stimulation types are called transcutaneous stimulation. So instead of using a magnet, what we might do is put an electrode an electrical electrode on the top of the head over the area that we want to stimulate. And we call this transcranial direct current stimulation or transcranial alternating current stimulation. There are some others, but these are the big ones. They're very popular because they're very cheap, but the evidence for this is pretty moderate. There's better evidence, I think, for TMS therapy at this time. So next is functional electrical stimulation. So with this, what we're doing is we're assisting. So some of you in the audience, I know, are going to have FES devices to help improve walking. So those are those little stimulators that you'll put over the tibialis anterior over the shin of the leg, and they will help with foot drop. So we use FES a lot in gait rehabilitation. We can use it as well. It's not used as much in upper limb rehabilitation. And where we're moving to is things like EMG triggered FES. So what the EMG triggered FES does is it senses that you want to make a movement, and then because you can't make a movement because the muscles aren't strong enough or the cortical muscle connections aren't strong enough, we assist the movement. We assist the intention of you to make that movement. And that leads us to a thing we call functional electrical therapy. I can actually take a stimulator, a more complex stimulator, and program it so that I can produce complete hand grasp. So I can open the hand, I can then close a hand over the object, and I can repeat that with a patient who's completely paralytic. As long as they have muscle function, they can complete that. And we can start them at a lower level of functioning. And then with the idea is to get them up to a higher level of functioning where we can start doing rehabilitation that doesn't allow, or voluntary rehabilitation that doesn't require the FES. Pharmaceutical interventions are really popular, but there's a caveat here. So one of the most important classes has been these SSRIs, so the serotonin or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So these are commonly meds that are given for depression, and there's one really common one, not for depression, but it's called fluoxetine. The trade name is Prozac. This was several years ago. This was thought to be almost the magic pill. It worked really, really, really well in animal experiments. And then when we transitioned it over to human studies, it didn't work quite as well. So it tends to be quite specific. It works in some people, but not in others, and we don't know why. And I'm telling you this story because I think it's really important. We do not have a magic pill. Not yet. We're working on it. We don't have a magic pill that will improve our rehabilitation. Some work, some of the others don't. So another class would be monoaminergic agents, so dopamine, noradrenergic stimulator. Essentially, they're like stimulators. They're like exciting the brain sort of more globally and putting it into a state where we call it priming. It's actually doing something similar to what we would do with the brain stimulation. So we're priming the brain to get it in a state where the brain is more receptible to change. So when we do the rehabilitation after this priming, the brain is in a better state to change in the way that we want to state it. A last class and a more recent class, it's actually this drug metformin that's been in the news was used for diabetes research. And in animals experiments, it was showing some really important changes at the cellular level in areas that we know are responsible for synaptic plasticity, for those cells being able to grow to one another and connect to one another. There's only been, I know that it's been all over the news. Some of you will have seen it. It's because it's fairly recent. But the caveat here is there's only really been one human study. And whilst that's positive, we need to think, well, we had a couple really good studies with fluoxetine. And then once we started doing the large clinical trials, we realized, well, it's not quite as effective as we initially hoped. So we have hope for metformin, but with the caveat that we've been down this road before, we shouldn't get too excited about it. We need to study it properly. But, as I say, we don't have a magic pill yet. We're working on that. The next group of technologies that might enhance neuroplasticity are what we call intelligent rehabilitation technology. So these would be the robotics, artificial intelligence, adaptive personalization, adaptive systems, digital therapeutics, those types of things. Now, as soon as I say robotics, sometimes we have therapists who are saying, "Oh, you're trying to replace me." No, that's not at all what we're trying to do. None of these things are going to replace your therapists. Your therapists are still critically important. What we're trying to do, again, is get the brain into a state. So if we take robotics, for example, if we put somebody in a robotic and we train them meaningfully, we can produce way more repetitions than we can if we use it without the robotics. So that it really adheres to that repetition principle. The challenge with robotics, so there's both a plus and a minus. The challenge with robotics is with some of that robotic technology, it just takes over function. So now we get back to the idea that, well, the brain's not actually engaged. It's not voluntarily trying to make these movements. It's the robot that's making the movements. So the brain doesn't really need to adapt. So we need that combination of robotics and AI assisted therapies to aid the movement, but not necessarily completely replace the movement. And that's sort of where we're going. So the ideal scenario would be, I want to make a movement. We get a device that senses I want to make a movement, and it helps me only as much as it needs to for me to be successful with that movement. That's what we're heading to. We're not quite yet there, but we're getting close. I mean, those are enormously difficult engineering problems to solve. So other emerging approaches. So we have neurofeedback, virtual augmented reality, non-invasive stimulation, and combinations of approaches. Now, just very quickly, I want to introduce the National Rehabilitation Center. So we're going to be looking at, it's opening, we think, in September. The idea is that we will have a hub and spoke model. We will be the national center, and we will work with other rehabilitation centers. We'll work with stroke, traumatic brain injury, spinal cord injury, major trauma, limb loss, and more really complex neurological conditions. So rehabilitation won't stop when they leave this facility. We'll continue that rehabilitation with outpatient services when they get home. And that's another really important thing. The rehabilitation has to continue after we leave the hospital. Otherwise, we get patients who will stop learning, and learn non-use will engage again. So, of course, we'll do traditional therapy. We actually have several robots in the hospital right now. We will be using intelligent weight relief. So that's typically used for gait rehabilitation. In this case, in the image here, you can see we're actually using it for arm rehabilitation. Cognitive therapy is really important. So we'll have devices that assist with cognitive therapy. We will have FES, or functional electrical stimulation therapies. We will have, in fact, I will have a lab in there called a neuroplasticity lab. And one of the big technologies we'll have there is transcranial magnetic stimulation therapy. And then finally, we'll use these enhanced environments. So I told you about when I started as a PhD student, we had people walking on treadmills looking at a blank wall. This is a system called a C-mill treadmill. This is, you can see a patient body weight support. He's got a screen that he can look at that moves as the treadmill moves. And you can see on the bed of the treadmill, we can actually put images. So in this case, that's an image that says, don't step on this. So he actually has to step over it. So we can have much more aggressive training in a safe environment. And of course, as I said, we want to be able to take some of this technology home. So one of the things that we'll do is have virtual rehabilitation and telerehabilitation. So the take-home messages then. So for many years, we thought that recovery was extremely limited. We now know that it's very different. The adult brain does remain capable of change throughout life. This change is driven by experience. That experience can produce adaptive neuroplasticity. It helps recovery, whereas maladaptive neuroplasticity reinforces a disability and learned or poorly learned behaviors. The role of rehabilitation, therefore, is to create the right experiences at the right time with the right level of challenge, repeating it often enough, and making it meaningful enough. And by doing this, we'll promote adaptive plasticity. So technology isn't going to replace these principles. Technology's purpose is to help us apply them more effectively, more intensively, and more personally than ever before. So just to finish, over a century ago, this fellow Santiago Ramon y Cajal believed that the adult brain couldn't change. Today, one of the greatest advances in neuroscience, in fact, over the last 30 years or so, is the recognition that we can change the human brain. Neuroplasticity gives us a genuine reason for optimism, I believe. And our challenge now is really to understand how to harness that capability of the changing brain to create the right experience at the right time and give everybody the greatest possibility of opportunity to recover from a stroke. Thank you all for your attention.